For weeks, Mira Quill called the police 12 times about the man who moved in next door. First, she claimed he was hauling stolen property out of an empty house. Then she insisted the sound of tools in his garage meant someone was breaking in. On the morning of the 12th call, Mira stood in the middle of the street and demanded officers place handcuffs on the single father watering his own lawn. The man did not argue. He simply looked at the two officers walking toward him and asked one quiet question. "Have you turned on your body cameras yet?" Both of them straightened their shoulders and answered together. "Good morning, incoming Police Chief Calder. If you want to see arrogance get defeated by nothing but the plain truth, press subscribe on this channel and stay for the final reversal that Mira never saw coming." Reese Calder arrived in Cedar Hollow on a quiet afternoon, carrying the last of his boxes into the house himself, with no moving crew and no city escort trailing behind him. He wore a plain gray shirt and drove a pickup truck that had seen better decades, and he worked without hurry, the way a man works when he has done this kind of labor alone more times than he can count. He had chosen this particular street for reasons that had nothing to do with prestige, wanting a quiet place where his daughter could finish her final year of school without the noise of downtown Ashford pressing in on every side. He had spent 2 decades building a career inside a much larger department, rising from a beat officer to a deputy chief known for tearing apart a body camera program that had quietly failed for years, and for dismantling an internal favor network that had protected officers who never should have kept their badges. None of that history showed on his face as he unloaded his boxes, because Reese long ago learned that the version of himself people needed to see rarely matched the version written on his record, and that the only honest way to understand a neighborhood was to walk into it as an ordinary man rather than an official one. Mira Quill had lived on that street for over 20 years, long enough to remember when every family on the block knew each other by name. And she carried a proprietary sense of the neighborhood that she rarely stopped to examine too closely. She crossed the street before Reese had even set the first box down, and she did not offer a greeting. Instead, she asked which delivery company he worked for and when the actual homeowner would be arriving to take possession of the property. When Reese told her plainly that he was the homeowner, she looked at his truck and his clothing and made no attempt to hide her disbelief, asking whether he could produce paperwork proving he had permission to be on the premises at all. He declined to show his deed to a stranger standing on the sidewalk, and within minutes Mira was on the phone describing a suspicious man removing belongings from a supposedly vacant house. Officer Callum Hale arrived to find Reese calm and unbothered, producing a driver's license with the new address and a signed closing statement, and finding no violation of any kind. Mira offered no apology, telling the responding officer that the neighborhood ought to be grateful someone was paying attention. That night, in a small notebook he had started keeping for exactly this purpose, Reese recorded the time, the officer's name, and a short, unemotional summary of what had happened, then sent the first entry to a woman named Captain Sienna Marlowe, under the subject line, "How the system responds before it knows who I am." He did not write the entry out of anger, though anger would have been a reasonable response, but out of the same discipline that had carried him through 2 decades of police work, the understanding that a single incident proved nothing, while a pattern carefully recorded could prove everything. Sitting at his kitchen table surrounded by unopened boxes, he thought briefly of his late wife, who used to tell him that patience was not the same thing as weakness, and that a man who could wait for the truth to reveal itself was more dangerous to wrongdoing than a man who shouted about it too early. He closed the notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed, knowing there would almost certainly be a second call before the week was finished. The next morning brought a second call, this one about the black sport utility vehicle parked in Reese's driveway, which Mira described as possibly stolen because its plates were still temporary. Officers checked the registration and confirmed the vehicle was entirely legitimate, and they left without incident, though Mira watched the entire exchange from behind her curtains with visible disappointment. A third call came 2 days later while Reese was mounting a tool rack inside his garage, and Mira told the dispatcher she had heard metal striking metal and suspected someone was attempting to break a lock or steal equipment. 2 officers returned, and Reese cooperated fully, though this time he asked why the ordinary sound of daytime home repair had been classified as a possible burglary in progress. Callum had no good answer for him, and on the dashboard screen of his patrol vehicle, he noticed the call had been flagged with a designation that read, "Priority per shift command." Reese began to suspect that Mira was not simply a neighbor carrying old prejudices from house to house, and that someone inside the department itself was helping her turn ordinary guesswork into manufactured emergencies. Mira stood at her window and smiled as the officers walked into Reese's garage, convinced that if the police kept showing up often enough, the man would eventually understand he did not belong on this street. Reese later learned the name of the officer approving these elevated priority levels was Lieutenant Kane Drayton, a longtime shift commander whose name kept surfacing in a growing stack of complaints that had somehow never been properly investigated. Drayton had worked Cedar Hollow's district for the better part of 15 years, long enough to know every association president, every board member, and every resident whose calls, for reasons never written down anywhere, were treated as more urgent than everyone else's. He had built his reputation on responsiveness, on being the commander who never let a resident of means wait more than a few minutes for a patrol car, and no one above him had ever asked too closely how he managed to keep that promise so consistently. Callum had worked under Drayton for less than 2 years, but he had already learned to recognize the particular tone the lieutenant used when a call needed to be pushed to the front of the queue, a tone that left no room for questions and no patience for officers who asked why. A 4th call was placed, while Reese checked his own mailbox, with Mira telling dispatch that a stranger was removing mail belonging to residents of the street. A 5th call followed that same evening when Reese walked the neighborhood to learn its layout, and Mira claimed he was studying windows and memorizing the routines of other families. This time, Officer Aria Quinn responded, and she recognized almost immediately that Reese was doing nothing more than walking on a public sidewalk in the evening air. She apologized for the inconvenience, but Reese asked her a question that was harder to answer than it sounded. 5 calls, all of them baseless, and yet the person being investigated each time was still him rather than the woman supplying false information again and again. Aria pulled the dispatch history and discovered the calls had never been linked together in the system, so that every single time Reese was treated as a brand new suspect instead of a repeat target of harassment. Mira continued telling other neighbors that Reese was being watched by police, twisting the consequences of her own calls into evidence that he must be dangerous after all. She had chaired the Homeowners Association for nearly 9 years, and in that time she had built a quiet reputation as the person who noticed things before anyone else did, a reputation she guarded carefully and never wanted challenged. To Mira, Reese's calm refusal to explain himself, his steady presence, his unwillingness to perform either gratitude or fear when officers arrived, read not as innocence but as arrogance, a kind of confidence she had decided a man like him had no right to carry on her street. She told herself repeatedly that her instincts had protected the neighborhood for years, and that this situation would prove no different, even as the number of unfounded calls climbed past what any reasonable person could still call an honest mistake. Reese never confronted her publicly during this stretch, choosing instead to let the system record on its own exactly how easily it could be manipulated by someone who knew which words to use. Aria quietly forwarded the 5-call history to Captain Marlowe, along with a pointed question about why Lieutenant Drayton kept personally adjusting the priority levels attached to a single address. Aria had been on the force for 11 years and had long ago developed a private habit of noticing patterns. other officers preferred not to see. The same 3 or 4 street names appearing again and again in the log, the same handful of callers whose complaints somehow always warranted a faster response than anyone else's. She had never before pieced together a pattern this deliberate. 5 calls in under 2 weeks against a single new resident. Every one of them unfounded. Every one of them elevated by the same commanding officer. Driving back to the station that evening, she found herself thinking not about procedure, but about her own younger brother, who had once been stopped 3 times in a single month walking home from his own job. And she decided quietly, and without telling anyone yet, that she would keep her own private record of everything that happened on that street from that point forward. Elara Calder returned home after several days staying with her grandmother, and as she stepped out of the car, she and her father fell into a light disagreement about whether she was ready to drive herself to a job interview alone. Mira stood behind her fence watching the exchange, then called the police to report a man raising his voice at a young woman who might be held there against her will. She had watched Elara come and go from the house for weeks by then, noting the hours she kept, the friends who occasionally dropped her off, building in her own mind a narrative she never once bothered to verify with a simple conversation over the fence. It did not occur to Mira that a father gently disagreeing with his teenage daughter about driving alone to a job interview was an ordinary moment repeated in nearly every household on the street, because by then she had already decided what kind of household this one must be, and every new piece of information was simply filtered through that decision rather than allowed to challenge it. It was the first time Mira had pulled Reese's daughter directly into the pattern she had been running for weeks. 2 patrol cars arrived, and Elara had to confirm in front of strangers that Reese was her father and that she was completely safe, feeling humiliated as Mira stood across the street performing concern for anyone who would watch. Elara wanted her father to reveal who he really was and end the harassment immediately. But Reese explained that if he used his position to shield only his own family, everyone without that same position would keep suffering exactly as before. He promised his daughter she would not become the next target and arranged for her to stay with her grandmother again until after his swearing-in ceremony had passed. Before she left, Elara told her father something that stayed with him for the rest of the investigation. That Mira was not calling out of fear at all, but because she enjoyed watching a man forced again and again to prove his own innocence. That single observation helped Reese finally understand the true shape of what was happening around him. He asked Captain Marlowe to preserve every original dispatch recording in full, rather than relying only on the written reports composed afterward. Later that night, after the patrol cars had gone and the street had settled back into silence, Reese sat on the edge of Elara's bed, the way he used to when she was small enough to be frightened by thunderstorms, and he apologized for something that was not entirely his fault, for choosing a house on a street that had turned out to require this much patience from both of them. Elara told him she was not scared, only tired of watching grown adults treat her father as a threat simply for standing in his own driveway. And Reese admitted quietly that he was tired too, though tired was not the same thing as ready to give up. He reminded her of something her mother used to say, that dignity was not something other people could grant or take away, only something a person carried with them, regardless of who happened to be watching. Elara hugged him before she left for her grandmother's house the next morning, and Reese stood in the driveway long after her car had disappeared around the corner, turning over in his mind everything his daughter had said about why Mira really made those calls. The reason. Reese had not yet revealed his position, traced back 3 months to the resignation of Ashford's previous chief, following a string of discrimination complaints that had finally become public. The city council selected Reese as the replacement, but delayed his formal announcement by 3 weeks, so he could conduct a quiet, unannounced review of how the department actually treated ordinary residents. Earlier reform efforts inside the department had repeatedly leaked before they could take hold, and officers preparing to report misconduct had mysteriously found themselves reassigned or disciplined instead. Only city manager Tessa Langford, Captain Marlowe, and the city attorney knew Reese had already signed his contract, and even most patrol officers believed their new chief would simply appear for the first time on Monday morning. Reese never set out to trap Mira into making a mistake, living his ordinary life, cooperating with every check, and never once invoking any authority he had not yet officially assumed. And yet her 6 calls had already shown him with painful clarity precisely what the city had hired him to investigate in the first place, a system that let personal prejudice, backed by the right connections, quietly transform itself into official state power. Marlowe discovered that Drayton had personally dismissed 3 earlier complaints about officers harassing black residents, and every one of those earlier complaints traced back to either Mira or the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association she chaired. Reese decided the investigation could no longer stop at Mira alone, and that he needed to uncover the full understanding between her and Lieutenant Drayton before anything else happened. When Tessa Langford first offered him the position, she had been direct about the reasons the previous chief had been forced out, describing a department where formal policy looked progressive on paper, while informal practice on the street told a very different story. She had warned him that at least one senior commander was believed to be steering resources and attention according to unwritten rules that favored certain neighborhoods and certain residents over others, though no one had ever been able to prove it with anything more than rumor and a stack of dismissed complaints. Reese had taken the job anyway, in part because he believed reform delivered from behind a desk rarely reached the people who needed it most, and in part because he wanted to know, before he ever sat behind that desk, exactly how deep the problem actually ran. Sitting alone in his new kitchen, reviewing everything Marlowe had sent him, he understood that Mira Quill, whatever her own private prejudices, had become only one piece of a much larger machine that Kane Drayton had spent years quietly building and protecting. Reese had seen this kind of machine before in other cities and under other names, and he had learned that dismantling it required more than removing one bad actor, since the machine tended to survive by convincing everyone around it that its behavior was simply how policing had always worked, a fact of life rather than a choice someone kept making. A 7th call came after a delivery driver mistakenly left a package on Mira's porch instead of Reese's, and Reese walked over, checked the label, saw his own name printed clearly on it, and carried it home. Mira immediately accused him of theft, and although her own doorbell camera plainly showed Reese's name on the box, Drayton still ordered a responding officer to file a formal incident report anyway. An 8th call followed while Reese repaired his lawnmower, with Mira describing the long wrench in his hand as a potential weapon. Arya objected to dispatching a unit at all, only to be reminded by Drayton that Mira was, in his words, a trusted member of the community. At a neighborhood meeting, Reese politely proposed adding language to the Homeowners Association bylaws that would discourage harassment carried out through repeated emergency calls, and Mira mocked him as a newcomer already trying to rewrite the street's traditions. When Reese asked what evidence supported any of her 9 accusations so far, she stormed outside and placed a 9th call, claiming he had just threatened her in front of the entire room, though 11 residents who witnessed the meeting confirmed Reese had never once raised his voice. Marlowe obtained a text message Drayton had sent Mira afterward that read simply, "Keep reporting him. Sooner or later, he slips." Proof the two of them were no longer acting independently of each other. Drayton had known Mira for nearly a decade, ever since she had helped organize a fundraiser that paid for new equipment his unit badly needed. And over the years, the two had developed an understanding neither of them ever spoke about directly, an arrangement where her concerns were always treated as credible, and her neighbors' complaints about her were always treated as noise. He told himself he was simply keeping the peace on a street that mattered to the department's public image. But underneath that justification sat something less comfortable, an old and familiar assumption about who belonged in a neighborhood like Cedar Hollow and who did not. Drayton had made this same calculation many times before without consequence, and nothing in his experience had yet taught him that this particular calculation might finally catch up with him. Reese realized their goal had grown beyond simply driving him out of the neighborhood, and that Drayton was actively trying to build a police file substantial enough to derail his appointment the moment his identity became public knowledge. Standing in the parking lot after the neighborhood meeting ended, Reese replayed the evening in his mind. The easy laughter among residents who had known each other for years. The way conversations simply stopped when he walked near a group. The small practiced politeness that never quite extended into welcome. He had encountered this particular kind of quiet exclusion before in other neighborhoods and other cities, and he had learned that it rarely announced itself directly, preferring instead to hide behind concerns about property values, unfamiliar faces, and the vague language of community standards. What made Cedar Hollow different was not the prejudice itself, but the machinery Mira had found to weaponize it. A lieutenant willing to bend dispatch priorities on her behalf, and a system too trusting of its own senior officers to ask hard questions. Reese drove home that night, resolved that whatever else came of his time on this street, he would not let that particular machinery survive his arrival untouched. Tessa arranged for an unmarked city vehicle to be delivered to Reese's house, so he could begin using it once his swearing-in ceremony was complete, and Mira, watching the delivery, immediately reported an unidentified vehicle being hidden inside a neighbor's garage. Drayton escalated the report to a possible stolen vehicle investigation, even though the vehicle identification number was already registered directly to the city itself. Callum was sent along with another officer, and while running the plate through his terminal, he noticed that Drayton had personally overridden a verification result confirming the vehicle's legitimate ownership. He began to understand for the first time with real clarity that Reese was being deliberately shaped into a suspect through the department's own internal tools. Reese still did not reveal his position, but he asked Callum directly whether he was prepared to sign his name to a report claiming the city's own vehicle had been stolen from its rightful owner. Callum refused to falsify anything, writing plainly that the call lacked any factual basis, and noting that the same complainant had now supplied inaccurate information on multiple prior occasions. Furious, Drayton summoned Callum back to the station and threatened to move him permanently onto overnight patrol as punishment. Callum quietly reached out to Captain Marlowe instead, agreeing to hand over documentation proving Drayton had repeatedly interfered with legitimate incident reports. Before ending that call, Callum warned her that Drayton was preparing something he called an officer safety alert, already carrying Reese Calder's name attached to it. Callum had joined the department 3 years earlier, believing with the sincerity of someone still new to the work that the badge existed to protect people, rather than to sort them into categories of who deserved protection and who deserved suspicion. The threat of overnight patrol did not frighten him nearly as much as the quieter realization that had been building inside him for days, that a man who had done nothing wrong was being systematically transformed into a threat through nothing more than paperwork and a commander's signature. I thought about the calm, unhurried way Reese had spoken to him at the scene of the stolen vehicle report, never raising his voice, never demanding special treatment, only asking questions that exposed one at a time exactly how broken the process had become. Driving home that night, Callum decided that whatever consequences followed, he would rather lose a comfortable shift assignment than spend another year pretending he had not seen what he had clearly seen. The 11th call came on Sunday evening, the night before Reese's official swearing in, while he stood on his porch testing the security lighting he had recently installed. Mira dialed emergency services and claimed he was armed and watching her house through the darkness. Reese did in fact carry a department-issued firearm in a concealed holster, entirely lawful, but the way Mira described the situation carried real risk of the moment spinning out of control. Drayton ordered responding units to approach with heightened caution. And Arya and Callum arrived together, deliberately keeping their distance, activating their body cameras, and issuing clear, calm instructions as they approached. Rhys complied without hesitation, keeping both hands visible and immediately announcing that he was carrying a licensed weapon, and the encounter ended without a single moment of real conflict. When asked exactly where she had seen the firearm, Mira admitted she had never actually seen it at all, explaining only that she simply felt a man like him would certainly be carrying one. Arya wrote that admission down word for word in her report. Rhys understood with a chill he did not show outwardly that with only slightly less disciplined officers on scene, one dishonest phone call could have put his life or his family's safety in genuine danger. He told Captain Marlowe the period of quiet observation was finished, and that by morning the entire file would be opened for review. That same night, Mira overheard Drayton promise her that one final call would provide more than enough justification to have Rhys arrested before he could cause what he called any further trouble. Rhys did not sleep well that night, lying awake and running through the encounter again and again, not because he doubted his own composure, but because he understood how easily a different set of officers, less careful or more anxious, might have reached for their weapons the moment Mira's words reached their radios. He thought of every family he had ever counseled after an encounter like this one had gone the wrong way, every funeral he had attended in his old city for young men whose only crime had been existing somewhere a frightened caller decided they should not be. It was not abstract to him, this gap between a false report and a real tragedy, and he understood now more clearly than any policy memo had ever taught him exactly how narrow that gap could become. Before finally falling asleep, he wrote one more line in his notebook, a note to himself rather than to Marlowe, reminding him that reform without urgency was simply another way of allowing the next mistake to happen. Monday morning. Rhys dressed in plain clothes and stepped outside to water his lawn before heading to his swearing-in ceremony downtown. Mira crossed the street and demanded to know why a delivery driver had recently dropped off what looked like a police uniform at his door. Rhys told her evenly that it was none of her concern. She grabbed at the hose in his hand and stepped uninvited onto his side of the property line. And when he asked her to leave, she called the police instead and reversed the entire story, claiming Rhys was now trespassing on her own land and demanding officers arrive immediately to place him in handcuffs. What Mira did not know was that the department's morning briefing had already concluded, and every officer on shift had already seen a photograph and biography of the city's incoming chief, Rhys Calder. Callum and Arya arrived at the scene, and Mira pointed directly at Rhys, repeatedly calling him a dangerous liar in front of the gathering crowd. Rhys asked the two officers a single calm question, whether their cameras were already recording, and when they confirmed they were, he asked only that the incident be handled by the book with no favoritism shown to anyone involved. Callum and Arya straightened together and spoke almost in unison. "Good morning, incoming Police Chief Calder." Mira went completely still, and several neighbors who had once believed every word she told them slowly began stepping out of their own front doors to watch. She quickly tried to soften her tone, insisting every previous call had come from nothing more than a responsible sense of civic duty. Rhys answered her without raising his voice at all, telling her that the title he now held did not make her 11 earlier calls anything other than wrong, because they had already been wrong from the very beginning. Mira forced a thin smile and announced that she would see him removed by the city council before he ever set foot inside department headquarters. Rhys did not answer her threat, choosing instead to finish coiling the garden hose he had dropped when she first crossed onto his lawn, and the deliberate calm in his movements unsettled her far more than any raised voice could have. He had rehearsed this exact possibility in his mind more than once over the previous weeks, understanding that his first public morning as chief might arrive not through a ceremony, but through exactly this kind of confrontation, and he had decided long before it happened that he would meet it the same way he had met every call before it, without theater and without anger, letting the facts speak for themselves once they were finally allowed to. Neighbors who had gathered on their porches watched the exchange in near silence, several of them exchanging glances that suggested private conversations were already beginning about calls Mira had made regarding their own families over the years. One elderly resident, a retired schoolteacher named Elias Finch, walked slowly across his lawn afterward and told Reese quietly that he had suspected for a long time something was wrong with how quickly police arrived at certain houses and not others. Though he had never had proof enough to say so aloud, Reese thanked him and said nothing more, aware that whatever trust he might eventually earn on this street would have to be built through consistent action rather than a single dramatic morning, however satisfying that morning had felt. Mira filed an emergency complaint with the city council the same afternoon, accusing Reese of concealing his identity in order to entrap an ordinary citizen and of using his new authority to pursue a personal act of revenge. Drayton backed her account, claiming Reese had conducted an unauthorized internal investigation well before he had any legal right to assume his duties. Several council members grew nervous that the unfolding scandal would damage the city's reputation, and they asked Reese to delay his ceremony until the matter had been resolved. Reese agreed to appear at a public hearing, but he refused to personally demand Mira's arrest or Drayton's discipline, choosing instead to hand the entire case file directly to state investigators in order to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. That single decision quietly dismantled the argument that he was simply seeking revenge. Captain Marlowe confirmed publicly that Reese's quiet review had already been approved by the council well before it began, meaning he had never investigated anyone without proper authority to do so. Arya and Callum turned over their body camera footage, the recovered text messages, and a full list of the irregular orders Drayton had issued throughout the previous month. Mira still believed that 12 separate calls taken individually could never prove any real pattern of prejudice. She had no idea the original dispatch recordings had already been fully restored. During the hearing itself, Tessa announced that the council would listen to all 12 calls played back in their exact original order. In the days leading up to the hearing, Reese resisted several suggestions from city attorneys who wanted him to lead with the vehicle theft accusation, arguing it was the most legally clean-cut example of Drayton's misconduct and would be the easiest for the council to understand quickly. Reese insisted instead that the calls be presented in the order they actually happened. From the very first afternoon, he unloaded boxes into his own driveway. Through the morning, he had nearly been arrested on his own front lawn, because he believed the pattern itself, unfolding in real time, would say more than any single incident ever could. Marlowe spent 2 long nights personally verifying the chain of custody on every recording, aware that a single procedural mistake could give Mira's attorney an opening to have the entire presentation dismissed. Tessa, for her part, quietly informed the council beforehand that this hearing was not simply about one lieutenant or one resident, but about whether the city was finally prepared to confront a pattern that had existed for years under the previous administration. She reminded them in private conversations held the week before that the eyes of the entire city were already on this case, whether they liked it or not, and that how they handled it would say far more about Ashford's future than any speech delivered at a ribbon-cutting ever could. The council chamber filled with residents and reporters, and Mira sat beside her attorney, still carrying the same confident posture she had worn for weeks. The recordings played one after another, and in the earliest calls, Mira's own words leaned heavily on phrases like "unfamiliar face," "does not belong here," and "does not look like the homeowner." As the calls progressed, her tone grew sharper and more revealing, and at one point, she openly admitted she had witnessed no actual crime, but still wanted officers to check on Reese because, in her words, A man like that does not move to a street like this without some kind of reason. The 11th recording silenced the entire room, capturing Mira admitting she had never actually seen a weapon, yet still wanted officers to treat Reese as though he were armed and dangerous. Afterward, the text exchange between Mira and Drayton appeared on the projector screen, showing Drayton had personally coached her to use words like threatening, trespassing, and armed, specifically because those terms forced dispatch to elevate the response level automatically. The final reversal arrived when Marlowe revealed that Drayton had used the exact same method against several other black residents over the years, meaning Reese was never truly the first target, only the first one who happened to hold enough authority to unlock the department's full history. Drayton was suspended on the spot and escorted from the chamber. Mira was removed from the city's community safety board before the meeting even adjourned. When a reporter asked Reese whether he wanted Mira arrested immediately, he answered that such a decision belonged to an independent prosecutor, not to him. As the recordings played, Reese sat perfectly still at the front of the chamber, refusing to react visibly even during the most damning exchanges, aware that every camera in the room was watching him as closely as it was watching Mira. He had decided beforehand that his composure mattered as much as the evidence itself, that a city still uncertain whether it could trust a black police chief did not need to see him celebrate another person's downfall, however deserved that downfall had become. Mira's attorney attempted several times to argue that individual misunderstandings did not amount to a coordinated pattern, but each objection grew weaker as the recordings continued, until even members of the council who had known Mira personally for years stopped meeting her eyes. Marlowe later told Reese that watching the room change over the course of 90 minutes had been the closest thing to real accountability she had witnessed in her entire career. 12 ordinary phone calls played back exactly as they happened, doing more to expose a broken system than a decade of internal memos ever had. The state investigation eventually concluded that Mira had repeatedly and knowingly supplied false information to emergency services, and she pleaded to a charge related to filing false reports, receiving fines, community service, and a formal order prohibiting any further contact with Reese or his household. Drayton was terminated from the department and later formally charged with falsifying records, abusing his authority, and obstructing multiple legitimate misconduct complaints over the years. Reese was officially sworn in as chief of the Ashford Police Department, and the very first policy he introduced required the dispatch system to automatically flag any pattern of repeated calls made against the same resident whenever no actual violation had ever been confirmed. Every call carrying signs of harassment would now require review by an independent commanding officer, and no resident would ever again receive automatic priority treatment simply because of a personal relationship with someone higher up the chain of command. Callum was formally protected from any retaliation, and Arya was placed in charge of a new team responsible for reforming how dispatch priorities were assigned across the entire city. Elara came home for good, and father and daughter spent an afternoon together replanting the small patch of lawn that had been trampled flat during the 12th call, working side by side in a silence that felt for the first time in weeks entirely peaceful rather than tense. She asked him while they worked whether he had ever doubted himself during those 3 quiet weeks, whether some part of him had wondered if staying calm and simply gathering evidence was really the right response to being treated the way he had been treated. Reese considered the question honestly before answering, telling her that doubt had visited him more than once, usually late at night, but that he had learned long ago the difference between doubting a strategy and doubting the truth underneath it. And the truth had never once wavered. Mira watched them from her window, but no patrol car ever again came rushing down the street simply because she had picked up her phone. A reporter later asked Reese what had angered him most through the entire ordeal, being doubted, being dismissed, or nearly being arrested on his own front lawn. Reese answered quietly that what angered him most was never that it had happened to a police chief, but that it had happened for years to people who never had a badge of their own to protect them. In the months that followed, the department's new dispatch policy caught 3 separate patterns of repeated unfounded calls against other residents across the city, each one investigated and resolved long before it could escalate into anything resembling what had happened on Reese's own street. Aria's team published its first quarterly report showing a measurable decline in duplicate calls tied to the same addresses. And for the first time in years, community meetings across Ashford began discussing trust rather than simply tolerating its absence. Callum was promoted the following spring, and he made a point of personally training new officers on the exact chain of decisions that had allowed Drayton's misconduct to continue unchecked for as long as it had. Mira eventually moved away from Cedar Hollow, though not before writing Reese a brief, unconvincing letter that he read once, folded carefully, and placed at the bottom of a drawer rather than the trash, a small reminder of how far a system could drift before someone finally forced it to look at itself honestly. Elias Finch, the retired schoolteacher who had crossed his lawn that first difficult morning, eventually joined the newly formed community advisory board that reviewed dispatch patterns each quarter, telling Reese once that he intended to spend whatever years he had left making sure no other family on that street ever had to prove their own innocence the way Reese had. The house at number 18, once viewed with suspicion by half the block, slowly became simply another home among many, indistinguishable from its neighbors in every way that actually mattered. Mira Quill called the police 12 times to prove that Reese Calder did not belong on her street. In the end, those same 12 calls proved something else entirely, that the person least qualified to decide who belonged there had been standing behind her own front door the whole time.